Good afternoon. On behalf of Kybernus and Grupo Salinas, I am very glad to welcome you all to our second panel of the cycle entitled Times of Crisis, Times of Leaders. In this conversation, our guests will address post-pandemic scenarios and challenges faced by educational systems in Mexico and worldwide. How will education be like, look like, and feel like after COVID-19? It is my pleasure to salute and thank the presence of Esther Wojcicki, professor, journalist, and author of the bestseller, How to Raise Successful People, Lessons for Radical Results, as well as University of Harvard professor and author of several books and articles that deal with educational and teaching issues, Fernando M.Reimers. I now give the floor to our friend and Kybernus member, Daniel Tapia, who will moderate the panel. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jorge. I appreciate your introduction. Welcome everybody to Kybernus webinars. My name is Daniel Tapia, Executive Director of Genera, a public policy consulting firm based in Puebla, Mexico. This webinar will be in English, but as Jorge said, later we will have the translation of this conversation available in Kybernus and Grupo Salinas social media accounts. Just as a reminder, we encourage those in the audience to submit your questions for the panelists, which will be addressed at the end of their interventions. Let's turn to the panel discussion. We have two great panelists who have joined us to offer some insights about the scenarios and challenges that educational innovation will face, and also to analyze the big trends we need to keep our eyes on that could directly impact the future of education in the coming years. Let me introduce our panelists to you. First, we have Esther Wokjcicki. Esther is a leading American educator, journalist, and mother, leader in blending learning and the integration of technology into education. She is the founder of the Media Arts program at Palo Alto High School. She also serves as vice chair of Creative Commons. Esther has been involved with Google and Google Edu since its inception, where she was one of the leaders in setting up the Google Teacher Academy and remains a guiding force. She has been awarded several times for her contributions on education. Specifically, in 2002, she was awarded with the California Teacher of the Year, and in 2016, she was distinguished the My Hero Award for her work in global education. Thank you, Esther, for joining us in this conversation.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Fernando M.Reimers. Fernando is the director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative and of the International Education Policy Master's Program at Harvard University. Fernando studies and teaches about innovative education policies and programs that helps a student develop competencies necessary for civic participation, work, and life in the 21st century. He is a member of UNESCO's High-Level Commission on the Futures of Education. With his colleagues from the OECD, the World Bank, and the 100 Organization, he is leading an effort to support educational continuity during the COVID-19 pandemic with applied research. Thank you, Fernando, for joining us in this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's begin. Esther, I would like to invite you to share with us a first reflection about the magnitude and the challenges that we can expect, but also how to hopefully rebuild education systems in a more innovative way. You have 7 minutes for your intervention.
Are the slides going to be up there, or should I just speak?
If you want, it will be better just to speak and explain the audience your statement.
Okay, so I think one of the problems that we have today is there's a lot of indecision. 1 week the students are supposed to go to school, the next week they're supposed to be online. And it's very hard for people to adjust that quickly. And it's very hard to learn when you're in a situation where there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, as a teacher, I can just tell you that when we had an accidental fire drill on campus, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 10 o'clock in the morning, whatever time it happened. After that fire drill, students had a very hard time concentrating. They were completely out of their normal pattern of behavior. So I think that's one of the problems that is facing the school system and the teachers today. There's uncertainty out there. And so it's hard for students to concentrate and hard for students to think about what they're going to be learning. The other problem that I see is that teachers are uncomfortable in many ways with using online learning. So what they've been doing in the spring, many of the teachers were using Zoom, and they were using Zoom calls to an excess. Actually, every teacher used it. So if you're a high school student and you had 7 classes, there was 7 classes of Zoom calls. Well, as we all know, 2 classes of Zoom calls are enough for 1 adult. How can kids take 7 classes of Zoom calls? And then the other thing is you can't talk. The teacher has the control. They can mute you. So you're muted, you can't even interact with your friends. That's the other major problem. So, and the third one, and then I'll be quiet so we can hear from Fernando, is the fact that the number one most important thing to kids really is friends. And what are we doing in the school to encourage kids to have relationships? I don't see anything happening, nothing. And, so, okay, now we have like the crisis in the spring, then we had, the crisis with, the tragic killing of George Floyd. And now in the fall, my prediction is we're going to have a mental health crisis because we have all these kids that have not been treated in ways that they can predict or ways that are healthy for them. They can't see their friends. So how long is this going to go on? In December, that'll be like almost a year for a lot of kids, So I think we need to rethink what we're doing with education now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther. I do believe that we need to rethink education. I would like to underline the importance of teachers profession. As you have said, they are feeling very overwhelmed and oversaturated. So we have to deal with that in terms to enhance learning and try to react in a more positive way with them. Let's go to Fernando. Fernando, which are the challenges or the scenarios that you might highlight for this COVID-19 pandemic context?
Let me talk about what is happening outside the world of school to then talk about the implications for schools in the present and in the immediate aftermath. And let me compare the present moment to the moment 4 decades ago when Costa Rica announced it was unable to meet its external debt obligations. And at the time, that seemed like a small event, but within 2 years, immediately after Costa Rica, Mexico did the same thing. Within 2 years, most countries in Latin America had declared a debt default. And that set in motion a process that was called the debt crisis, which some people have come to recognize as the lost decade in Latin America. The lost decade meant that in a period of extreme economic austerity, where you have no money to pay teachers in real times, your very best teachers leave the profession. They become taxi drivers, they work in hotels, they leave the country if they can. And so it takes 30 years to build an educational system, but you can destroy it pretty quickly if you completely defund it. So I want to come to the present moment, because the present crisis is having and will have an impact in the world, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Depression of the 1930s. We have not seen in 100 years a situation where all economic engines in the world shut down at the same time as they have right now. So just to put this in perspective, the World Bank anticipates that the contraction of gross domestic product is going to be 5% of GDP. For most of Latin America, it's much higher. For Mexico, it's 10%. For Peru, it's 12%. Most of this impact is going to fall disproportionately on the poor. the people who live in most vulnerable conditions. So the great efforts that poor families had made to support the education of their kids are going to become much harder to sustain in a point where hunger is growing as it is today as we speak. So I think it's very important for people to become aware of the magnitude of the crisis upon us. And just to think in historical terms, the last time we had a pandemic, a global pandemic of this scale, much bigger actually, was 100 years ago, 1918. I'll tell you the impact of that pandemic in Germany. That pandemic arrived in Germany the very same year the Weimar Republic was beginning. But it had an impact of depressing municipal spending because the state basically had to cover the health cost of this pandemic. And that pushed a lot of people to the edges. And some of those individuals radicalized, became extremists, intolerant people who only associated with people like themselves. In ordinary circumstances, those people would not have been a problem. But in that context, in the context created by that economic recession, it made a total unknown named Adolf Hitler, who had the patience of building a coalition among all these extremely intolerant groups, elected Chancellor of Germany within 12 years. And we know the rest of that. So I don't think it's an exaggeration. Of course, at that time, at the time of that pandemic, there were 500 million people infected and 50 million who have died. So by comparison, we're still in a pretty good place. But I think we should not underestimate the social and the economic effects of this pandemic in our societies. All kinds of things can happen in a pandemic. So in that context, we should ask, what should schools do? And I think the most important thing that schools, anyone in a leadership position should do is to convey hope to children and to everybody. That
I agree.
At the end of this long night, there is going to be a better way. Not hope on the basis of lying to people, not hope on the basis of denying the severity of the crisis, but hope on the basis of spotlighting the fact that there are people every day doing extraordinary things in the most difficult circumstances. And that as we recognize them, as we show people a path to how do we build a better world during and after this pandemic, a world where everyone belongs, where everyone feels included, in which we relate to the earth in a way that is sustainable, I think it's especially important to do this now. The last thing that we need is to let people fall into despair, because that's when you have a situation like the situation in 1918. And that requires leadership. And sadly, when you look around the world, there are great disparities in the available leadership. The situation Esther is describing, which I think is very adept to the United States, is a real sign. It's a real tragedy of failure of national leadership at the highest levels, and in many school districts, of very confused leadership, of leaders who are sitting on their hands, trying to wait until the last minute, instead of taking action. Action, speaking with the truth, inviting with humility people to collaborate and so on. At the same time, I think it is important to recognize that there are good things happening. Over the last 3 months, as part of this effort that you mentioned, Daniel, I have been looking at innovative efforts around the world and what it is that people are doing. And I'm glad I'm doing it for my own mental health, because it does give me hope, and it helps me give other people hope, to show that there are people working with street children in Mumbai who are using WhatsApp to check in on the well-being of kids who live in crowded quarters where all the family lives in one room. And there are foundations doing the same with street children in Chile. So I think that should inspire all of us, and it should also, in a context where you begin to recognize that good things are possible, we can also hold all leaders accountable, including governments, and to tell them how come others with much less than you do are managing to create opportunity. How can you excuse sitting in your hands in this terrible global calamity?
That's very interesting, Fernando.
That was great. He's absolutely right. That's a great analysis. It helps us really understand what's going on. And it's the lack of leadership in the United States that is really, it's driving everybody crazy. I mean, every morning we get up and we find something else crazy in the news. And we can't even remember the crazy thing that happened last week because we're so busy worrying about the crazy thing that just happened today. And You know, the kids are also miserable. They can't be ignored. They feel just as uncertain and unhappy as we are, if not more. And we're all trying to make them have a better life. But honestly, I think you're right, Fernando. I think this is a major issue that's coming. It's a huge.
But you know well, Esther, that schools are not condemned to simply reflect the larger society in which they are. Schools can also be spaces that anticipate a better society. Schools have enough autonomy where a teacher in her classroom, a principal, can show to the kids that there is a better way. And I think this is a time that demands extraordinary teacher leadership and educator leadership in creating within our schools a microcosm of what is possible, of what can be, of a society that we anticipate is more sane, where we pay attention to the facts, to evidence, where we have solidarity with others. And I'm hoping that this time will come sooner rather than later, I hope.
I think you're right. Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say that teachers can take the leadership role, and they should take the leadership role, and hopefully they will. But a lot of teachers are very worried themselves. And also, you know, as a teacher, I mean, I was considered a maverick teacher, which is like I was doing whatever I thought was right. But most teachers are not like that. Most teachers follow the rules, and the rules change every day. And then it changes, and then the kids change. It's like, so I made my own rules, and I wasn't paying any attention to what the other people were doing, but there aren't very many other people out there that do that. We need to empower them to do that, especially the teachers.
I agree.
So sorry, Danielle.
No, don't worry. Let's talk about the consequences of having poor leadership in the world and the implications for education, because I think that you are highlighting a very powerful sentence about leadership and its consequences. You, Fernando and Esther, you have been discussing with teachers, principals, decision makers, former ministers of education, during the last months about the consequences of having poor leadership. What are the scenarios that we can expect from the leaderships that we have in emerging countries, and also in some of the countries that we might have as an example, for example, European countries or Australia or New Zealand? Would you please emphasize some of your insights about the effects of a very effective leadership on these crises, on these COVID-19 pandemic crisis?
Well, from my perspective, there have been incredibly successful leadership in countries like New Zealand and Greenland, and countries, it's remarkable how that has functioned. And I'm close to people in Denmark. The Danish kids are going to school. Mm-hmm. I mean, the leadership is what either makes or just breaks whatever is going on. And we just have terrible leadership. And today, a reporter asked Trump, you know, if you aren't elected, you know, in November, are you going to apologize for all the lies that you told American citizens? And he refused to answer it, and he just went to the next question. He wouldn't say anything. Mm-hmm. I mean, and then there was an article about, you know, are we going to prosecute Trump if he is not elected again, you know? I mean, it's been a terrible situation. So many people have died. So many people are afraid. And then I read an article that I couldn't believe, where somewhere in Florida, they forbid people from wearing masks. You can't wear a mask. It's not allowed. It's like, the only thing I could think of is, well, you know, they're going to die. But I guess, anyway, I didn't even know what to think. But as a teacher, I can tell you, I do a newsletter every morning, and a lot of my students follow that newsletter, and they read what's going on. And then also, well, this spring, when we were in the midst of this chaos, I let my students run the Zoom calls themselves. That was the only time during the day that they actually got to talk to each other. All the other calls were the typical call where, you know, the teacher's in charge and they mute everybody. I don't know. But I do think we need to give more power, more sense of self to teachers. They can really make a difference.
Thanks, Esther. Now let's go to Fernando.
A couple of examples of good leadership that I have observed as part of this work that I'm doing, studying kind of outliers, positive deviants, people who are doing good things, mavericks, people who are not following the rules, but really working for the kids. When the government of Colombia decided that they were going to shut down the schools back in March, the Secretary of Education of Bogota called an open town hall meeting to which she invited teachers, students, and principals. And she said, I need your help. Let's figure out together how we're going to continue to educate during this pandemic. And then she reached out to her own staff and she said, I don't have the solution to these, but I'm confident that together within this system, we have the knowledge that we need to make it work. And they began to create an alternative way of delivery that was imperfect, but very much like the national leaders of New Zealand, of Australia, of Germany that Esther has mentioned, which basically took action based on facts. This is what this woman did in Colombia. And she built, initially, they basically began to do online learning and then discovered pretty quickly that that only reached 30% of the kids. And then they developed agreements with TV stations and they got another 20%, and then radios, and then packages. But the important thing is that in the humility of this leader to recognize that she didn't have the answer, but if she knew how to listen, and if she could create a process where people could listen to one another, they would figure out something. I think that was the genius. The Secretary of Education of the state of Sao Paulo did exactly the same thing. Now, it's a good thing that he had previously been the Secretary of Education of Amazonas, which is one of the poorest places in Brazil. And he had actually done a lot with online learning because it's the only thing that can work in a place where you have very low density of population. Same thing, when the government said we're shutting down the schools, he convened essentially the 10 most influential business leaders in Sao Paulo, and he said, I need your help. I don't know how we're going to do this, but this is a serious crisis, and it's going to help me out. And he also reached out to a university, a public university, which had developed a leadership program from which he had graduated. He had been my student. And the university began to work with him. So again, as in Colombia, the humility of these leaders to understand that the first thing they had to do in this crisis was to listen and to create the conditions that invited others within their system at all levels outside the system to be part of the solution was phenomenal. I'll give you a third example. In Chile, when the government shut down the schools, Chile has an organization very much like Teach for America. In fact, it's part of the same network. And two 20-somethings said, who's going to teach our kids if the schools don't function? And so they had seen in a newsletter that their peers in Nigeria had used their mobile phones to record lessons. And they had broadcasted those lessons using WhatsApp. And they said, well, if they can do it in Nigeria, we can do it. So they began the same thing. Their lessons were pretty humorous. So within a week, not only their kids, but their parents, others in the community were listening to these lessons. It was the only education going on in a city, in a municipality that was in lockdown. The mayor of that city had the humility to recognize that this was brilliant. So he sent an email to a listserv with all the mayors of Chile. And within 2 weeks, 250 mayors had built partnerships with radio stations that were broadcasting these lessons developed by two 25-year-olds. And so to me, those examples speak about several things. Number one, good ideas can come from anywhere. Governments don't have the monopoly of good ideas. Number two, the role of good leaders is to make it possible for those good ideas to emerge wherever they are, and to support them, and to promote collaboration, to break down the barriers that exist within a system, between a system and others. And there are leaders doing that at the moment, even as we speak. So to some extent, to Esther's point, I have a lot of colleagues in leadership positions in this country, and I myself serve on the State Board of Higher Education for a while. I have found it a little bit difficult to get their attention and even to engage in some of these efforts. Perhaps because we're more accustomed to following the rules, perhaps because we think we have things under control, or perhaps because we're all discombobulated from the situation that we're in that is so disorienting that it disempowers us. We forget our own leadership. But you know, in Brazil, which has also had fairly poor national leadership, sort of like the US, in a president that is a denier, doesn't believe in science, he invents his own remedies, he likes to lie to the people, tell them this thing is going to wash away magically and so on. In that context, where the president had, during this crisis, there was no national minister of education. What that caused was for state ministers and for civil society to basically fill that leadership vacuum. And I think that is my great hope, that in this day and age, with the tools that we have, tools like these, it is possible for leadership to come from anywhere. It is possible for every person to be a leader and to do what is within our reach and to invite others and to do what is right for the kids. And so I'm hopeful. I mean, I talked earlier about the 1918 pandemic, and I do worry a lot about the breakdown of democracy because I follow with great concern events in the United States. But, you know, there was another pandemic that began in 1340-something, the bubonic plague, which in 2 years wiped out a third of the population of Italy. And that pandemic, you can imagine how painful that was, had the effect of upsetting a lot of the existing social structures, which were pretty stagnant, by the way. I mean, at that time, you were either born with some privilege or with none at all, and origin was destiny, and that was the end of it. But at that time, all of a sudden, people begin to pay attention to the corruption of the church and of political elites, and they begin to question, why does it have to be that way? And there is a family that does something really counterintuitive, the Medicis. And, you know, this is a few decades after that, when everybody running their little cities is basically spending the money they have and they don't fighting with each other, they say, we're not even going to have an army. We're not going to do that. We're going to invest in peace. And the way to invest in peace is we're going to fund the arts and we're going to fund sciences. Now, remember, this is before we have science. They're funding Leonardo da Vinci as their great science, and Donatello, and Raphael, and Machiavello. And Lorenzo de' Medici produced something called the Medici effect. Out of this concentration of talent from different fields that he brings together in that small city, eventually comes the Italian Renaissance.
Oh my God.
My hope is that we actually have a choice, that it doesn't have to be like the breakdown of democracy in Germany once Hitler rose to power, that it could be a renaissance if we each do what is within our reach and within our power, especially where our people in formal positions of authority are clearly not up to the job. What we should do is change them when we can, but we should step up.
I agree 100%. Okay, so we need to get together because I've got the same philosophy. I wrote it in this book I have, you know, what's called How to Raise Successful People. I have an acronym. The acronym is TRICK, T-R-I-C-K, and it stands for trust, respect, independence, collaboration, and kindness. So you trust people, you respect them, you give them independence, you collaborate. You don't dictate. You bring ideas out of them. You are humble, just like you said. You know, best leaders you have today are humble people who collaborate and elicit the best ideas that come from whoever it is that you're working with. That is what we need. And that was it was a great example in Italy about hopefully we can have a renaissance because boy, we're ready for a renaissance.
I agree.
Esther, Fernando, I think both of you are giving us a lesson of why it is important to lead in these complex times, but also hopefully a sense of the responsibility that each of us have to deal with this task. I believe that both of you have underlined very powerful examples about the importance of learning from the crisis. So let's move on to an additional question that I would like to discuss with both of you, and it's about the consequences that COVID-19 will have on the education sector. do you think the COVID-19 be the catalyst for new innovations as the education sector is nudged to change? Esther, and then Fernando.
Yeah, I think okay, pandemic is bad. We've had a lot of problems, but that I think is the bright spot in the pandemic. It's going to totally disrupt the education system. They cannot teach the same way they've been teaching since, I don't know, 300 years this way. They're going to have to change. And I mean, back in, the early 1900s and even the middle 1900s, the way that information education was transmitted was through lecture. And if you didn't sit in a lecture, you couldn't learn. There was one other way. You could get a book out of the library, but you had to be able to read in order to get the book. Today, we have so many ways to learn. I mean, you've got video, you've got your phone, you've got your computer, I would just ask the average American, when's the last time they went to the library? And they probably can't even remember, because whenever you want to find out any information, what do? You just go on your phone, right? We all go on our phone. The crazy thing that was happening in the United States, schools were banning phones. I never banned phones, ever. I always taught my students how to use the phone to get the information that they wanted and how to self-regulate. So no, you don't use a phone when you're having dinner with other people. No, you don't use a phone when you're walking across the street and you could get hit by a car. There's ways you should and shouldn't use a phone, and you don't use it, when you're in class. But I actually let the kids come up with all the rules regulating how to use the phone. And since they came up with the rules, I'll tell you, they always obeyed them because they came up with them. I didn't have to enforce anything. So I think that we have quite an opportunity to make change now. We're forced into making change. Everybody wants to go back to the normal. The new normal will not be like the old normal, fortunately.
I agree with Esther that things are very likely to change. And I think that there are 4 drivers. One of them is that the situation that we're in, I think, is causing many people to pay attention to what kind of world we were living in. And, just our own fragility, the fact that we all fear for our lives, that we all know that we could be infected and we could be one of the dead or a close relative could be, I think, is causing people to just think a little bit more slowly about what is the meaning of what we do. And that's a good thing. Sometimes I think we live lives in a very fast pace and don't really pay attention. The second driver is that because of the time that children have spent at home, I think that many parents have paid a lot more attention to what was happening and not happening in schools. And many educators have actually gotten to know their kids and their families better than they knew them. And I think only good things can come out of that understanding, that there should be a continuum, that the school shouldn't be a little silo disconnected from society, that the experience of a kid should be a seamless experience. So I think that you can do 2 things. We have discovered the power of technology in good ways. I think we're still learning, but I'll speak about my own institution, Harvard. I've spent the last 12 years trying to persuade some of my colleagues that we should be offering degrees online or partly online. And I had been completely unsuccessful. And I always hit this wall. They would tell me Harvard will never give a degree without a residential requirement, because that's a decision that the corporation must make, and they're not going to make it. So, there are places that teach partly online. Well, the corporation decided in a week that they were going to let every school decide what to do, and 6 schools decided that my school, the School of Education, is teaching the entire year online. And we have spent this summer, the faculty, immersing ourselves in tons of professional development. So I am delighted. On the one hand, I admire the professionalism of my colleagues, of everybody who has basically said, we are so serious about this work, we want to do it well, that we're going to learn everything we can. Is it going to be perfect? I suppose no. But we have taken a very difficult step in a short period of time, and I don't think we're going to go back once we discover the potential of these tools. And then lastly, I think the driver of innovation is going to be, I talked about the Medici effect that Lorenzo de Medici created in Florence. There is an ongoing Medici effect on cyberspace. The conversation we're having right now, we're having conversations of this sort. Every educator has, over the last 3 months, participated in many more conversations with people who are seeing the world differently than they had probably in the previous 20 years. And only good things can come from that. So I'm hopeful that in the education sector, we're ready for innovation. I just hope that the rest of society is a supportive context and that we don't get too many negative surprises on that sort that kind of squander the opportunity. But I think on the education front, my hope is very good. I don't have the same concerns I have about the economy and politics.
It's great.
Thank you very much, Fernando, Esther. Let's talk about these barriers and also these drivers to enhance innovation in education systems and also within the schools. Why is it difficult? Why is it very difficult to innovate in schools, Esther? And Fernando, why is it so difficult to innovate in education systems as a whole? Is it about poor leadership? Is it about a political willingness, or it's about the context? What do you think about these conditions, or also the barriers that the main stakeholders of the education system and at schools have to face to enhance change?
Well, so if you take a look at schools, they were set up as institutions to perpetuate tradition and to pass along learning that was considered important in that society. And so it's very hard to change an institution that's supposed to perpetuate tradition. It was not, I mean, it's just in the last 20 years that people say schools are supposed to teach innovation and creativity. Before that, it was schools are supposed to teach you, what was it, history and geography, and it was all memorization, everything that you can memorize. And then also, here's another fact that is, I don't know how to get rid of this one. People tend to teach the way they were taught, and they tend to parent the way they were parented. And even if they make a decision that they don't want to parent the same way they were parented, somehow there's a gut reaction where people do that. And even when you have professional development for teachers and like spend 2 days or 3 days doing professional development, and then you go and take a look in their classroom next week and see, so what was the impact of the professional development? I swear you don't see any change. It's just like the same thing all over again. And I was like, didn't you guys learn anything? Don't you want to implement something? And there's the, oh, well, you know, we don't have time to do it now. We'll think about doing it later. And it never happens. And so some people say there's 2 institutions in society that are impossible to change. Number 1 is the church. And number 2 are the schools. So I think that's part of the problem. And now the schools have to change. They're being forced to change, which I think is one of the good things, that hopefully something good will come out of the fact that they're forced to change.
Fernando?
Yeah, I agree with Esther's assessment. I would only add that, you know, organizations are a great human invention. They help us organize collaboration and achieve things we couldn't achieve alone. But if you look at the history of organizations and you go back 10,000 years, you can find kind of 5 types of organizations. So 10,000 years ago, we have small clans, right? People who are basically small bands of people, mostly relatives, who are banding together for survival. So those things allow you to protect yourself from a saber-toothed tiger, but they don't really allow you to have much control over your life. Then 4,000 years ago, this is Mesopotamia, we invent a different kind of organization, also hierarchical, also top-down, but really very large organization. And they enable you to do 2 things. One, to achieve great things like build pyramids or organize agriculture, and they enable you to think about the long term. So that's a huge invention. But if you look at how those organizations are run, it's ruthless power from the top, really command and control. Then you go back to the creation of bureaucracies, which is when schools were invented. And the great invention here is, you know, there should be division of labor. and there should be expertise guiding what we do. So let's build bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, as Weber imagined it, was a good thing. The idea was, let's have people with expert knowledge do what they're supposed to. Not necessarily design the goals of the organization, but specialize. And that's when our public schools were invented. Relative to what we had before, it's amazing what they did. In a relatively short period of 200 years, they re-engineered the cultural DNA of humanity. 200 years ago, less than 10% of the world's population attended school. Today is 99%. I cannot think of a more important revolution in our history. Not the invention of the internet, the iPhone, anything. It's just the invention of these deficient institution that basically gave us the means to provide every member of our species a shared experience in this institution we invented to, yes, mostly conserve what we had on. But we had other two institutions, other forms of institutions, which I think schools haven't yet, for the most part, been able to transition to. You then have organizations that are pluralistic organizations. So it's an organization where some people say, you know, the goals of the organization may not be the right goals. And when you look at progressive social change in the world, whether it's the women's movement, whether it's the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, they all begin out of that. They begin with a band of people who question the goals of the political party, of the nation, and who over time help people see things they were not able to see before. So it's very important in an organization to do what the Secretary of Education of Bogota did, which is, if you're in a leadership position, to not assume that you are the only one, because you have formal authority, to set the goals. And then there is finally another stage of organization. If you think at contemporary, a good research group functions that way, which are organizations that are basically driven by the values of the people who work in them, where there is such an alignment between the things that we each consider, and such clarity, the things we each consider are important to the survival of humanity, to the well-being of how we live, that you basically don't need to manage people. They are not necessarily organizations of mavericks, but they're very empowering organizations, because you don't need anyone to tell you what you have to do. You know what you have to do. You have been brought into a place where you can bring your whole self. You can bring your heart, your values, your sense of what's important, your sense of purpose is what guides you, is what makes you accountable. And I think where schools are, you know, when we're lucky, they function like bureaucracies. In some places, systems function like tribes. They function like the church, which is a more primitive organization than a bureaucracy. They really are like the Mesopotamia creation. And so obviously, relative to that, a professional bureaucracy is a better thing. But it's an incomplete thing. In a world that is changing rapidly, to not have the means to empower every person to basically express dissent, to basically help reinvent the mission. You know, people throw the term learning organization around easily. That's to some extent what it means, an organization that is truly capable to function to activate the shared intelligence of all of its members. Very few schools work like that. Some do. And I think we should try to steer them in that direction. Having said that, the last 4 months have been a period in many places of tremendous innovation by design or by default. And a lot of that innovation has come from teachers and from people in civil society. So we should try to pause and understand what made that possible and how do we keep it going.
So you are amazing with historical perspective. I must tell you how much I appreciate this. Really, you learn a lot of history and then it doesn't seem to mean very much. But, you know, I don't know if you've written any books, but I should buy them.
I'll send you some.
Yes, right, Fernando. Now, why don't we start by establishing what has been happening to students and families during the closures that we have to date? And also, we might take advantage of one of our audience participants, Maria Loreto Hernandez Espinosa. She's striking up an interesting point about the effects of this COVID-19 pandemic on families. We are aware that families are working very hard now during remote learning, and we're putting also them under stress. So in that sense, how has remote learning been going overall, specifically on learning, and how has it worked for families and students? Hester, why don't we first go to you and then with Fernando?
So families, first of all, most families that I'm familiar with here in California, they were frightened to do anything. They were, everybody was wearing masks all over the place. It was crazy. And then they realized that all the families were unhappy. Kids were unhappy and they didn't know what to do. And, you know, we thought it was going to last for a few weeks. Then we thought it was going to last for a month. And then, you know, by the time here we are in August, and it's been going on since February. So right now what's going on in the US, or at least locally here, is there's groups of families that get together that know each other well, maybe 4 or 5 families, and they're starting kind of a micro school, micro camps, micro opportunities for kids to get together and work together. And there's a demand for teachers who might not want to be in the system. Do you want to come and, you know, be the teacher for the year? Because a lot of families are like, well, you know, one week it's yes, and the next week it's no. And it's like, well, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm just going to set my own school up. And then, you know, maybe next year at this time, they'll have a vaccine or therapeutic. So that's what's going on with the families. They have been really impacted, you know, and if you read about it, a lot of mothers especially, they're like, this is really not the way to live. You know, I cannot work and be a mother at the same time. And you can't do that. And mothers and fathers, there's a lot of problems out there. So people are looking for solutions on their own because they've lost faith in the system to provide any kind of a solution. And I know my daughters, I have 3 daughters and I have 10 grandchildren, and all of them are going to the micro school. Can you believe that? Ridiculous. And other people, so I've been also helping people find teachers. It's all a result of a lack of leadership that people can trust and believe in. That's the problem. And so you know, people in Mexico, I feel really sorry, because if you don't know somebody that can be a teacher for your kids, I don't know what they're going to do.
Yeah, that's a huge dilemma that we are going to face. Fernando?
So in Massachusetts, we see similar things to what Esther is describing, growing, exiting the system, or creation of private opportunities because people think that the system has failed them. But to speak to your question, how is this working for families? Let me tell you where I'm getting this information. So about 6 months ago, a colleague of mine at the School of Public Health, I actually was planning a trip to Mexico during our spring break. And he said, I advise you not to go. At that point, if you remember, it was only in March 11th that the Secretary General of the World Health Organization declared this a pandemic. But already 2 weeks, 3 weeks before that, we knew that there were infections happening around the world. And he said, this is going to go on for a while. I would not plan on making any trips for the next 18 to 24 months. And I thought, oh my goodness, what is this going to mean for education? Because we don't really have a playbook for how to teach if people cannot meet. And so I reached out to colleagues in 5 large development organizations. I said, we should be trying to do some research that can provide some guidance, because people are going to be steering in the night without any information on what to do here. And Andreas Schleicher at the OECD responded right away, like within 20 minutes after sending him an email. He said, what do you want to do? I said, well, let's first send a survey out to teachers, to principals around the world, and ask them, what impact do you foresee the closure of schools is going to have on you? And so we did that. You probably have seen that information we published. The results were terrible. I mean, they taught me this is the end of the world for education. We're going to lose over the next 2 years all the gains on educational opportunity, and especially on closing equity gap that we have made over the last 50 years. We're going to lose them in 2 years. But then we did other things. We studied things that were working, and then we did another survey 3.5 months later, about a month ago. And to my surprise, and we basically examined what have you done. And to my surprise, most jurisdictions around the world, and we cover about 100 countries, actually had done something. Is it perfect? Is it working? No. We did ask teachers to give us their estimates as to how many kids were being reached and how much of the curriculum they could cover. And you know, if I summarize 100 countries, the stylized facts are the teachers estimate we're reaching about half of the kids and we're covering maybe about half of the intended curriculum, which is a lot better than I had anticipated 5 months ago. If you think about it, again, put it in perspective, right? To be able to, in no time, improvise an alternative way to deliver education and to be able to deliver some education is remarkable. But the story here is that what this is doing is it is augmenting every possible gap in opportunity that pre-existed and made it worse. Gaps within societies, gaps between societies. So I think that's going to be the big dilemma we're going to have. And to go back to the political complications and the analogy with Germany, unless we understand and we internalize that this pandemic has created a much more unequal system than we had, because not every family is able to make the arrangements that Esther is describing. I see the same thing here. For some families, what I see here are groups of families are getting together in groups of 5. They each contribute $200 a week, and they hired a phenomenal new teacher, and you know, they're set. They basically have arranged private tutoring for their
private tutoring for a whole year.
Kids. Well, what if you don't have the $200 a week? For some families, that's what they need to survive, to eat. So I don't know how we're going to solve that, but I do think that is the single biggest problem that we're going to be left with.
I agree 100% with what Fernando just said. That is the biggest problem. Inequity is growing, and it's only going to get worse. And, you know, I'm trying to figure out what to do to make it better, develop some kind of an app, some kind of a game, some kind of something to make it better. Because I just, the thought of all these kids not being able to have any kind of education for the next 6 months, it could be a year, you know, we don't know how long this is going to go on. I think it's really,
well, I think part of what we have to do is to counter this. I mean, there are governments around the world deciding this is too complicated. We're just going to shut down the schools for a year or two, and then we'll pick it up. Uganda is doing this. Kenya is considering the same. I think that would be a disaster.
I do too.
Disaster. Imagine if you're a 15-year-old girl who's poor and you've been hanging to your school by your teeth, right? Because there are so many other demands forced on you, and you disconnect from school for a year or two. Do you think you're going to come back to school? Of course not. I think those 2 years you have a child, people now see you as a woman, even though you're still a girl. So that's the end of your education. So I don't think it should be an option for any jurisdiction to say this is too complicated, we're just going to shut it down. There is always something that you can do. Even if all you can do is education with WhatsApp, with radio, with television, with mobile libraries that travel around the place, that's better than nothing. That's better than nothing. And I think that is something that those of you who work in communications have a big opportunity. Present a narrative. If we say this is an impossible problem to solve, a lot of people are off the hook. If you say, no, this is a very challenging problem, we haven't faced anything similar before, but you know what? There are plenty of people doing the impossible to sustain opportunity. And that's what we should expect of everyone.
Yes, collaboration. You said it previously in one of your comments about what's going on in Bolivia. You know, collaborate, get people together and let them come up with a solution, work together as a team. The school district, you know, it doesn't ever ask the parents what they think. Never. It just makes a decision, an arbitrary decision, and then no input. I mean, where's the democracy here? So it's a problem.
Esther, Fernando, we have a question from the audience. It says, one of the positive aspects that COVID-19 brought was a great visibility to the need for schools and communities. In your personal perspective, what opportunities does this crisis present to build back better, to enhance education systems and the learning opportunities for all children?
Well, the main thing I think it can bring back is effective use of technology to support teaching. Prior to this pandemic, I think that many teachers said they were using technology effectively, but it was just a joke. When push came to shove, we could see they didn't even know how to use Google Docs. I was like, how can you not have, I couldn't believe it. But we've had to retrain teachers all over to use just the simple things. So I think that's okay. That's a positive outcome because they're all going to know how to do it, and they all admit that they didn't know how to do it. So using technology, and I'm talking about supporting teachers, not replacing them, supporting them, so that gives them more time to actually work and do things that are more effective with the class, as opposed to all this lecture. It takes a long time to write a lecture. I know, I did it. And so, if I don't have to do it, it's much better. If the kids can learn even more, that's better. There's a lot of great lectures. There's like edX and Coursera, and it's all these things. You want to listen to a lecture? I have a lecture for you. So that's what I think the positive will be. Using tech to support the teacher.
My hope, I don't know if this is going to work that way, is that this crisis will cause us to begin to think of children as whole human beings and to begin to think of education as educating the whole child. It's not a new idea. It's an idea that Pestalozzi had, that Maria Montessori had, that many people have had, but we kind of forget it. We kind of forget the idea, and then we think that we can break down little kids into little pieces and teach them one thing and so on. And when you have a whole child, when you have a whole child conception, a very important piece of that is the ethical dimension of kids. I think that the choices, the dilemmas that we're facing throughout this pandemic and that we're going to face in the post-pandemic are for the most part all ethical dilemmas. And we should be exercising those muscles. Who do we think it is acceptable to leave behind? It was as a result of another tragedy caused by humans, World War II, that humanity, meeting where Esther is in San Francisco, in the San Francisco Opera House, decided that the way to prevent that kind of horror, they were talking about the Holocaust, they were talking about a war that caused the lives of 85 million people. The way to prevent that kind of horror from ever happening again was to invent a little document, which is basically an ethical framework that said we should build a world where every human, just because they are human, has the following 30 rights. And I think that the solutions to the worst crisis of humanity always begin with great ethical, great moral clarity. And so I'm hoping that we're not going to be as afraid as having these conversations about the difficult choices we need to make so we engage with the earth in a way that is sustainable. I mean, the climate change is the other big pandemic that is happening. It's only happening a little bit more slowly than this pandemic, not a lot more slowly. And the reason we can't tackle it is because we find it very difficult to talk about the ethical trade-offs between what am I willing to give up in terms of present comfort so we have an earth to pass on to our children and to our grandchildren. Right. So schools should be activating that moral imagination of children, should be engaging them in conversations about these moral dilemmas, should help them understand themselves as people with a historical responsibility in our time. So that's my hope, that this crisis will cause us to think deeply about what matters, to see children as whole children, and to build an ethical foundation to have a society that is more ethical here and everyone, where everyone belongs and where there is room for everyone.
Here's the last question. As you know, Kybernus is focused on, is a program that is focusing its efforts to promote and enhance leadership and has a very important program to promote the great influence of leadership for transforming reality. One of the questions from the audience is, how can we as young leaders contribute in solving, supporting, and helping others to face this difficult reality due to COVID-19 pandemic? Please, we will have 2 minutes to answer this question, both of you.
Well, I think collaboration is the key. They need to work together as teams, and they need to bring a lot of people together and then come up with ideas that they can implement. And They should make sure that they're including everybody. I mean, everybody. Some of those poor people out there that don't have an opportunity to speak up, they should definitely find out. What do you think? What are your needs? How can we make sure that you're included? You know, none of us have a good life when we look next door or look down the street and see people suffering. Nobody. I mean, we have to take care of each other. It's a community. It's a community. It's not just a community of a country. It's a community of the world. We have to take care of our planet too. I mean, I just keep reading about terrible things connected with climate change. Nobody's even paying attention to climate change now because of Trump, and every day there's another crisis. But, you know, we need to work together. And I have great faith in the human spirit to be able to come up with a solution. And like Fernando was saying, we have to educate the whole child. You know, we stop breaking it up in little parts. You know, it's the whole kid. And Maria Montessori had a great system. And one of the systems that I use, and I've used all through my teaching career, is, I guess you could call it Maria Montessori for high schools. That's what I've done. And it works. You know, I give kids a lot of responsibility. I trust them. I collaborate with them. They come up with amazing things. And not only that, they become leaders, leaders who care about other people in the world. That's what young people need to do. Let them work together.
I agree. My message would be just do something. The only thing you should fear is to be indifferent to all the suffering that is happening around you. You should not be afraid of not getting it right, of making mistakes. Just do something. Whatever is with you, you don't need to be a hero. Find a group, find a problem that you want to be a part of the solution, and then do what is within your reach, and then learn from that, and then do it better, and learn from that, and do it better. I also would suggest, I'll give you an example of what that means for me in my old age. I mean, I feel young at heart, but I decided that I had to do something at this time to alleviate that suffering. And so I've been writing children's books, and these are children's books designed to promote conversations between grandparents and their grandchildren around inclusive values, right? And so I made these books available on YouTube as narrations for free 3 months ago. The ones in Spanish, it's going through the roof. You know, like 80,000 people are reading these things. So what is that telling me? That when you take the risk to do something, when you choose action over inaction, people will respond. And, you know, the response may not be what you expect, but you learn from that, and then you do it better. So I'm going to, now that I know that Esther has all these grandchildren, I'll send you a copy of my book so you can read them to them and you can discuss them.
I will love to do that.
Good. Terrific.
Thank you very much, Esther, Fernando. We are almost at the end of this webinar. We have been getting a ton of questions, and thank you to all the audience for their enthusiastic engagement. Unfortunately, we can address all of them, but thank you for your participation. I would like again to thank Esther and Fernando for joining us. We're very, very grateful for your time. Also, thanks to Kybernus and Grupo Salinas for organizing these interesting and relevant panels to address the most challenging topics and discuss how leaders can contribute to a better world. I'm just so hopeful for our future because I'm aware that many young leaders from different backgrounds and contexts, specifically in Mexico, are leading and in some way are replicating positive actions to develop better environments. So thank you very much. Jorge, would you like to say a final words to our panelists, please?
Well, I just want to thank you, Daniel, for a wonderful and fantastic moderation of the table. And of course, Fernando, Esther, thank you very much. Your words were, I'm sure, very motivating for our audience. And I hope to see you both soon, anytime in the future. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Fernando, in the name of Grupo Salinas and Kybernus. It was wonderful having you this afternoon, this night.
Thank you for the opportunity. You made my day. You reminded me that every day there are good people everywhere doing good things, and that is what gives me energy to keep going. So thank you all. It was a pleasure.
I would like to say the same thing. Fernando, he's so great. He says such great things and he says them so well. So thank you very much for including me, and it does give me hope.